What is truth? What does it mean for something to be true? Here are two definitions of truth that I looked up on Google. 1. The quality or state of being true. 2. That which is true or in accordance with fact or reality. Here are some definitions of true that I found on Google. 1. In accordance with fact or reality. 2. Accurate or exact. Truth, we can summarize, essentially, is the property of being true. And to be true is to be in accordance with fact or reality, or accurate, or exact. These dictionary definitions don't help us to get to the bottom of the issue, though. They replace one term we don't understand, true, with related terms that we also don't understand, fact, reality, etc. What we really need is a theory of the meaning of the word true, a theory that explains how the term is used, which we can examine to get insight into the meaning. Before we can develop a theory of truth, we need to gather some observations about truth. Let's start by using the words true and truth, and falsehood, in a mixture of obviously true statements and truisms whose truth might be less clear in some cases. It is true that smoking causes lung cancer. Smoking causes lung cancer is a true statement. It is false that water is made of methane. Water is made of methane is a false statement. No statement is both true and false. Every statement is either true or false. What's true is true, and what's false is false, independently of what people believe, say, or wish. Truth is something worth pursuing. Truth is the opposite of falsehood. Not everybody agrees with all of these statements that I just gave. Let's examine the ones that are controversial. Starting with, no statement is both true and false. This truism is sometimes called the law of non-contradiction. This is the least controversial of our controversial statements. Almost everybody who comments on the topic agrees that a statement that is both true and false is an impossibility and would be an absurdity, at least if we're talking about a sufficiently precise statement of fact. Opponents of no statement is both true and false are sometimes called dialetheists. Dialetheism is the view that there are true contradictions, i.e., statements that are both true and false at exactly the same time in exactly the same sense. Examples of dialetheists include Graham Priest, J.C. Beale, and the author. It is not a purpose of this text to argue for dialetheism, though the author is a dialetheist, but for more detail on this topic, see the section titled Paradoxes and the section titled The Law of One, both forthcoming. Okay, so for the purposes of this text, the reader will not be greatly discouraged from regarding dialetheists as a strange group of people with a bizarre view that ought to be rejected. Okay, so here is a typical argument in favor of dialetheism. This is an argument called the liar paradox. Consider the statement, this statement is false. Call this statement L. In other words, L is the statement, L is false. If L is true, then L is false, because that's what L says. If L is false, then it's false that L is false, because that's what L says. Meaning that L is true, since every statement is either true or false. In short, if L is true, then L is false, and if L is false, then L is true. Since L is either true or false, L is therefore both true and false. One can reject this argument in favor of dialetheism in many different ways. In the modern academic debate on dialetheism, the liar paradox is not usually presented as an argument in favor of dialetheism, because so many ways of blocking the argument are known. Rather, the liar paradox, the argument itself, is taken as an object of study in the debate on dialetheism. The usual response to the liar paradox, the response of most of the world, is what we can call the indifferent shrug, after David Lewis, who I think coined that term, or at least introduced it to me. So this is a mode of response where one disregards the argument and its conclusion without providing any reason to do so. The indifferent shrug is not necessarily an irrational response to the liar paradox, in my opinion. Life is short, and there are many things to do in the world. If somebody feels that they should not devote their time to evaluating an argument with a patently absurd and yet pointless conclusion, I can't necessarily say that their decision-making is poor. Although I would also say I've personally benefited from studying the liar paradox and similar paradoxes. I feel that it's greatly informed my understanding of philosophy in ways that I valued. And it's undeniable that the indifferent shrug is not a satisfactory response to everybody. I would therefore like to provide what I think is a better response to the liar paradox for people who don't wish to agree with me that there are true contradictions, and also don't find the indifferent shrug to be a satisfactory response. So that's going to be in the section titled Paradoxes, and I will not do that right now as we need further background material first. So that completes our discussion of the law of non-contradiction. And let's move on to our next controversial statement about truth. Every statement is either true or false. This truism is sometimes called the law of the excluded middle. It states, in other words, that there are no statements which are neither true nor false. Aristotle is the earliest writer I'm aware of to have asserted this law when he wrote, "There cannot be an intermediate between contradictories, but of one subject we must either affirm or deny any one predicate." That's from the Metaphysics, Book 4, Part 7. The law of the excluded middle is a feature of the standard rules for first-order logic, and it is a popular idea among logicians that the law of the excluded middle is true. However, it is also a somewhat popular idea that the law is not true. And here are some possible examples of statements that are neither true nor false. Christianity is a good religion. Whether Christianity is a good religion depends on what one thinks makes for a good religion. Some would argue that there is no such thing as a good religion, and Christianity has been a net bad for the world. Others would argue that Christianity is not only a good religion, but the only good religion. There are many perspectives in between. One may argue that this multiplicity of conflicting perspectives, each with at least a grain of truth to it, means that Christianity is a good religion is neither true nor false. Okay, next statement. Science is reliable. So why might this be neither true nor false? Well, reliable in what sense? Science is not reliable in the sense that following the scientific method doesn't guarantee that you will arrive at the truth, and scientists seem to make mistakes and get things wrong frequently. Science is reliable in the sense that we can rely on it to continue to provide us with new facts about the world, as long as people continue to follow the method. Science is probably reliable and unreliable in other senses too. So, science is reliable isn't a specific enough statement to be true or false. Okay, next statement. Liberals are tolerant. Why might this be neither true nor false? Different liberals are tolerant of different things to different degrees. Liberals vary between each other in how tolerant they are, and individual liberals vary in how tolerant they are of different things. For example, some liberals might be intolerant of homosexuals, but intolerant of religious believers. And here in this case, by liberals, I mean people who call themselves liberals. Okay, next statement. The King of America is short. Why might this be neither true nor false? Well, there is no King of America, so the statement certainly isn't true. However, if it were false, that might mean its negation was true, and the negation of the King of America is short is the King of America is not short, which isn't true either. Okay, next statement. The continuum hypothesis is true. So why might that be neither true nor false? Well, the continuum hypothesis is a statement about sets, which can be neither proven nor disproven on the basis of any widely accepted axioms about sets or any widely accepted statements about sets. The continuum hypothesis, being a possibly unsolvable question about a type of thing, sets that may themselves be an imagination of humans, may be neither true nor false. So it's not obviously necessary to accept any of these as genuine counterexamples to the law of the excluded middle. Christianity as a good religion, you can argue, is either true or false, given further definition of good. Like any statement, it requires context clarifying the meaning of the terms in order to be true or false. But given that, the statement is either true or false, one can argue. Science is reliable can be addressed in the same way. Given context clarifying the meaning of reliable, the statement is true or false, one can argue. Liberals are tolerant can be addressed in the same way, right? Who do we mean by liberals? What do we mean by tolerant? The King of America is short is not true or false because the meaning or referent of the term, the King of America, is not clarified by the context of the world as it exists today and has existed in the past. This needs to be understood as giving us a limitation on the law of the excluded middle. As applied to our version of first-order logic, the limitation is that the law only applies to statements that are interpretable in the given context. This makes our original statement of the law of the excluded middle, every statement is either true or false, not literally true. One can, however, understand the original statement as being truncated language, a simplified statement of the law, rather than being a falsehood. Okay, so essentially, right, this is the same kind of case, right? The King of America is not short, would be true or false given context clarifying the meaning of the King of America and the meaning of short. This is the same kind of case. All right, so the continuum hypothesis. One can certainly maintain that the continuum hypothesis is either true or false. For example, one can be a mathematical Platonist about sets. That is, one can maintain that there is an objective reality of sets existing in a heavenly Platonic realm outside of space-time, and that one with perfect knowledge of this reality, e.g. God, would be able to know whether or not the continuum hypothesis was true or false by observing the universe of sets. So my aim is not to say that the reader should accept these arguments as showing that the law of the excluded middle is true. And by these arguments, right, I mean the refutations I just gave of these possible counterexamples to the law of the excluded middle. So what I'm aiming to show here is that the law of the excluded middle is remarkably defensible and can be defended against all the counterexamples I can give. And, you know, of course, the reader is encouraged to form their own opinion. And I should clarify here, right, like all of these ride on this, like, implicit qualifier to the law of the excluded middle, right? Like, you know, given context, providing sufficiently precise meaning to the terms. And so, right, in a sense, right, we're rejecting that the law of the excluded middle applies to all statements in all contexts, right, while maintaining that there are some limited classes of statements in contexts, and within that every statement is either true or false. Okay, so now let's turn to an aspect of this that's pretty uncontroversial. So when it comes to sufficiently precise statements of fact about ordinary medium-sized physical objects, such statements are always either true or false if there is an objective reality which conforms to our ordinary common sense beliefs about physical reality, namely, that there is a fully existent physical reality whose parts all exist in a single determinate state where every detail that could be investigated exists in a determinate state, even when it's not being observed. And so in short, right, you know, assuming there's a real world out there, then sufficiently precise statements of fact about ordinary medium-sized physical objects are always either true or false. Now, a person can reject the principle that sufficiently precise statements of fact about ordinary medium-sized physical objects are always either true or false if they reject the premise that there is an objective reality whose parts all exist in a fully determinate state even when not being observed. I am not aware of any conclusive arguments for the stated premise, i.e., that there is a real world, that, all parts exist, fully determinate state, right? So there is basis for controversy about whether sufficiently precise statements of fact about ordinary medium-sized physical objects are always either true or false. And I'm not, saying that that controversy is likely to resolve necessarily, right, in favor of refuting this if-then statement. I think the case for this if-then statement is pretty solid, and that's why it's uncontroversial, but, I'm definitely not giving you the entire debate here, and this is open to, interpretation according to your opinion. Okay, so many classes of statements are decidable, meaning it is possible to write a computer program which decides whether statements in that class are true or false. In other words, the program takes as input a statement in the class, and as output, it correctly says either that the statement is true or that the statement is false. If a class of statements is decidable, then most would agree that every statement in the class is either true or false. The argument, essentially, is that in principle, one could run the program on any of these statements, and the program would correctly tell you either that the statement is true or that it's false. But presumably, the statement was already true or false, whichever it is, before you ran the program, assuming it's that kind of statement, right? Like if it's a statement of arithmetic or something. So therefore, it's already true or false, even if we don't run the program. I'm not aware of much controversy about this reasoning, but you can reject it if you're willing to say that mathematical statements don't become true or false until people prove or disprove them. So an example of a class of decidable statements are bounded quantifier arithmetical statements. So in other words, statements of P&O arithmetic, where you've got like first order logic with addition, multiplication, less than, equality, and the objects that the variables stand for are natural numbers, and all of the quantifiers are bounded by some arithmetical expression. So for all x less than some expression, right, with addition and multiplication. That's what a bounded quantifier arithmetical statement is. And you can learn more about them on Wikipedia. I also have a to-do to talk about them in here, but that's not done yet. All right, so let's take stock. Most of the time in the course of life, we are happy to assume that statements are either true or false. Most of the time, assuming that a statement is either true or false will not lead us into any kind of error, unless the statement is, too ill-defined to be true or false. And therefore, right, sometimes it is inappropriate to assume that a statement is either true or false, as with the statement Christianity is good or the statement science is reliable, with no further clarification of the meanings of the terms in those statements. So it's generally safe to assume that sufficiently precise statements of fact about ordinary medium-sized physical objects are either true or false. It is generally safe to assume that mathematical statements are either true or false, because mathematicians regularly do so in the course of proofs. It is a generally accepted rule of mathematics that mathematical statements are either true or false. However, some schools of thought on math, such as most constructivist schools, reject the idea that every mathematical statement is either true or false. For example, consider some universally quantified mathematical statement, i.e., a mathematical statement of the form, for all x, a. Let's call this statement P. Let's suppose P cannot be proven constructively, and that no counterexamples to P can be constructed, or in other words, P cannot be disproven constructively. Then a constructivist might say that P is neither true nor false. And So, constructivists, just to be clear, are people who think that in order to prove something, you have to construct an example, you have to construct a proof, like a demonstration showing that the statement is true. That's what constructivism is. So since not every statement of mathematics can be proven or disproven on the basis of whatever axioms we choose, that's a consequence of Gödel's incompleteness theorem. Constructivists have to think, well, there are some statements that are neither true nor false, probably. All right, so exactly how broadly we can assume that statements are either true or false is a matter of controversy. Most would agree that statements in decidable classes, like bounded quantifier arithmetical statements, are all either true or false. Most think the same about sufficiently precise statements of fact about medium-sized physical objects. I think that most mathematicians accept the law of the excluded middle as applied to math. I think most people in general, and most philosophers accept the law of the excluded middle as applied to, sufficiently precise statements, where the context has clarified the meanings of the terms to such a degree that, there's no substantial ambiguity left. Okay, and that's probably about as broadly as I can think of to phrase the law of the excluded middle and still have it be true. And we're going to revisit this question later, and I'm going to argue for that conclusion, right? That, in any context where all of your terms have sufficiently precise meanings, the law of the excluded middle can be regarded as true without, like in any practical context, right? That I'm going to argue that in the section on logic, but I haven't argued that yet. All right, and the reader is encouraged to form their own opinion and to use their judgment in applying the law of the excluded middle, right? Since, even on the strongest formulation I can offer, right, it's still sometimes inappropriate to apply it. So practically speaking, I think the reader will find the law of the excluded middle as a useful logical tool, which they feel comfortable applying in essentially any real-world case where it's applicable. All right, next, controversial statement about truth. What's true is true, and what's false is false, independently of what people believe, say, or wish. So this truism strikes me as basically untrue, in that what's true is dependent on what people say, and more specifically on how people talk. For example, water is not made of methane is true in part because of the conventional definitions of water and methane. If methane was instead defined to mean H2O according to standard conventions, then the statement, water is not made of methane, would be false. So what's true is dependent on how people talk. And, this kind of reasoning can be generalized to show that, for every statement, whether it's true is dependent on how people talk, since every statement is made up of words which need some previously established meanings for the statement to be intelligible. Okay, so what if we assume some fixed framework of definitions? Is what's true true and what's false false, independently of what people believe, say, or wish, as long as we hold fixed a framework of definitions of words? So I think for practical purposes, basically, yes, at least when talking about sufficiently precise statements of fact about medium-sized physical objects. If you fix your definitions and, they're specific enough, um, then yeah, and you're talking about, the real world that's not like under the control of the whims of our minds. The outside world that seems to be out of our control, except by indirect means. Um, yeah, then what's true is true and what's false is false, independently of what people believe, say, or wish, pretty much for practical purposes, I would say. And you can form your own opinion, of course. Okay, so truth is something worth pursuing. This truism is not always accepted. Um, this is the next controversial statement, that truth is something worth pursuing. So not always accepted, but in the author's opinion, looking at our experiences in life and at historical events supports the view that things are better in almost all cases when people have the truth about issues that matter. So when we understand the causes of diseases, we are in a position to prevent and cure them with medical science. When we know the truth about the politicians who represent us, we can hold them accountable more easily and increase the likelihood that the politicians in office are good, ethical people. When we understand how the natural world works, we can make technology that allows us to farm more efficiently and produce far more food with a given amount of human labor, allowing most of the human population in developed countries to occupy themselves with activities other than agriculture. When we know the truth about scientific and political debates, such as the climate change debate, we can make the right decisions that will be best for the future. When we know the truth about what's going on in our personal lives, we can make decisions that will be more likely to strengthen our relationships and avoid future suffering. When we hold values that are based on deep and thorough analysis of the world as it actually is, our values are more likely to bias us towards making decisions that will be helpful in our lives and the lives of others. And of course, like there are plenty of white lies. Some would argue where you're better off if you tell them. I can't say I've found any real need for white lies in my life, although I have found plenty of need for omission of the truth, like sometimes to spare people's feelings, and that continues to be like an ongoing thing that I think about. Of course, it's a deep, complex issue. But yeah, I'm just saying, right, for issues that matter, it's better almost all the time when people have the truth. So in my opinion, the consequences of pursuing and sharing the truth are almost always preferable in the long run to the consequences of attempting to conceal, evade, ignore, denigrate, distort, or escape the truth. And a life lived in truth and love, in my experience, is a happy and fulfilling life. Pursuing and sharing the truth brings great joy, and it brings lessons which help one in all aspects of life and living. By pursuing the truth, one can learn the lessons of morality more deeply and experience the fulfillment of a life well lived. Pursuing the truth in bonds of love and trust with others who share the same goal greatly amplifies the efforts of all and produces a far better outcome, in my experience. So here's a summary of the truisms discussion. We've completed our discussion of the non-obvious truisms about truth that I listed, and we've certainly unearthed a bit about truth in the process. Let's take stock. The law of non-contradiction states that no statement is both true and false. This law is endorsed by almost everybody who speaks on the subject, except for some mavericks, such as dialetheists, who think that some statements are both true and false. One argument in favor of dialetheism is the liar paradox. This argument can be blocked in numerous ways, but we have yet to discuss that. The indifferent shrug, however, seems to be a fair enough response. The law of the excluded middle states that every statement is either true or false. The law of the excluded middle is controversial, and neither side in the debate has struck a decisive blow in the author's awareness, so the reader is encouraged to form their own opinion. What's true is true, and what's false is false, independently of what people believe, say, or wish, at least when you're talking about sufficiently precise statements of fact, about ordinary medium-sized physical objects, and relative to a fixed framework of definitions of words. Truth is worth pursuing. A life of pursuing truth and love, in the author's opinion, is the best life available on this earth. Just to strengthen slightly, right, my summary of the law of the excluded middle discussion, right, I also want to point out um, that in the section titled Logic, I'm going to argue more rigorously that that law is correct. Um, the same basically can be said for the law of non-contradiction, although that one actually breaks down into like a bunch of different laws if you look at it like on a close formal examination, and it's hard to say what it means, like because I'm a dialetheist, right? I believe in it in some sense, in the sense that I'm a believer in classical logic, but then I also think there are true contradictions. So that one is a hard one for me to say whether I agree or disagree with it. But in some sense, in a fairly substantive sense, a strong sense, I am going to defend it. Okay. So, what is truth? And what is true? Earlier I wrote, what we really need is a theory of the meaning of the word true, a theory that explains how the term is used, which we can examine to get insight into the meaning. Many theories of the meaning of the word true are based on a principle called the T-schema. The T-schema is a principle which people have observed about the word true, which can be stated abstractly as follows. For any statement A, the statement A is true if and only if A. For example, the statement water is wet is true if and only if water is wet. The statement snow is warm is true if and only if snow is warm. So note, A if and only if B means the same as if A then B and if B then A. Theories of truth based on the T-schema have been worked on by many people, including, for example, Alfred Tarski and Crispin Wright. A simple theory of truth based on the T-schema is Horwitzian minimalism, a sort of view based on the writings of Paul Horwich. Horwitzian minimalism, as I will formulate it, states essentially that the T-schema explains the meaning of the word true by stating the fundamental rule governing the usage of the word true. If the T-schema is a definition of true, then it is what we can call an axiomatic definition. An axiomatic definition of a word defines the meaning of the word by giving some statements involving the word that are true by the definition of the word. The T-schema is an infinite set or schema of statements that are, arguably, true by definition of the word true, that explain how to use the word true in the usage of that word defined in the sense of axiomatic definition by the T-schema. Okay, so a further example of an axiomatic definition is the axiomatic definition of the word and, given by the following two rules. First, from A and B, you may infer A, and you may infer B. Second, from the statement A and the statement B, you may infer the statement A and B. So now we can look at the precise version of my formulation of Horwitzian minimalism. Horwitzian minimalism. The T-schema is an axiomatic definition of true. And the T-schema, to recall, says for all statements A, the statement A is true if and only if A. So, I do not claim that my formulation of Horwitzian minimalism is either essentially original, or in the same spirit as Paul Horwich's view, or the same as the understandings of other philosophers who have endorsed Horwitzian minimalism. I think it's likely that these all things generally line up pretty closely, right? That's why I'm calling this Horwitzian minimalism, but I'm not saying they line up, right? I don't wanna misrepresent anybody's view or anything like that. Nonetheless, I will henceforth use the phrase Horwitzian minimalism to mean the view that the T-schema is an axiomatic definition of true. I myself believe this formulation of Horwitzian minimalism. It is a very modest view. All it claims is that the T-schema defines a meaning for true. It doesn't claim that this is the only possible meaning for true. The notion of axiomatic definition is a small variation on Bob Hale and Crispin Wright's concept of an implicit definition. The concept of implicit definitions is explained in the opening paragraph to the linked paper. Here's a quote from that paper. An explicit definition aims to supply a semantically equivalent expression of the same syntactic type as its definiendum, i.e. the word it's defining. Or, they're allowing for non-words potentially, right? So definiendum is that which is defined. Implicit definition, taken as the complement of explicit, right? So here Hale and Wright are saying, so an explicit definition supplies a semantically equivalent expression of the same syntactic type as what it's defining. So like dictionary definitions, for example, are explicit definitions, right? A lighter is a tool used to produce fire to light something else on fire. I just gave an explicit definition of lighter. And implicit definitions are taken as the complement of explicit, right? Here Hale and Wright simply mean an implicit definition is any definition that's not explicit. And it embraces a variety of subtypes, they're saying. And so to continue the quote, what all have in common is the idea that we may fix the meaning of an expression by imposing some form of constraint on the use of longer expressions, typically whole sentences, containing it. End quote. Hale and Wright define implicit definition as the complement of explicit definition. I disagree with their claim in this paper that all subtypes of implicit definition have in common the idea that we may fix the meaning of an expression by imposing some form of constraint on the use of longer expressions containing it. As a plausible counterexample, I provide ostensive definitions, which are definitions of words made by literally or figuratively pointing at examples. For example, pointing at a dog and saying dog. Now, ostensive definitions are not explicit definitions. I think that's pretty clear. So by Hale and Wright, they are implicit definitions. But they don't, in any sense that's apparent to me, fix the meaning of the words they define by imposing some form of constraint on the use of longer expressions containing them. Right? So babies learn words before they learn to form sentences. Right? So dog could be a baby's first word, right? And they're able to use the word correctly, right? Like they see a dog and they say, dog, right? So they know how to use the word dog, but they don't know how to form any sentences containing the word dog at this point. And so, it seems pretty clear then that an ostensive definition does not fix the meaning of an expression by imposing some form of constraint on the use of longer expressions containing the word dog. That's not what ostensive definitions do. And so that's why I'm disagreeing with this paragraph taken out of Hale and Wright. So where does that leave us? So it's possible that the category Hale and Wright defined in this paper contains more things than they intended it to, or it's possible that they think that ostensive definitions meet their characterization of implicit definitions, or it's possible that they've had the same train of thought that I just gave you and have since revised their thinking. Right? I'm no expert on either philosopher's work, so I'm just pointing out possible ways of looking at this paragraph and interpreting their possible intentions that aren't ruled out by the information at hand, which, all the information I'm drawing on here is just this paragraph that I quoted. All right, so the category of axiomatic definitions seems to be narrower even than the category of implicit definitions in Hale and Wright's narrower sense. of definitions which fix the meaning of an expression by imposing some form of constraint on the use of longer expressions containing it. Alright, so in summary, what I'm saying is you have three categories strictly contained in each other. So you have the category of implicit definitions in the sense of non-explicit definitions, right? And I'm saying that is strictly larger than the category of definitions which fix the meaning of an expression by imposing some form of constraint on the use of longer expressions containing it. And then that category of definitions is strictly larger than the category of axiomatic definitions that I've defined. Now, finding an example of a non-axiomatic definition meeting Hale and Wright's narrower condition is left as an exercise to the reader, and I haven't solved this exercise myself, and while it may be tricky, I suspect that it's solvable. And please contact me if you come up with a solution, or if you come up with a good argument that there is no solution because axiomatic definitions and implicit definitions in Hale and Wright's narrower sense are equivalent, right? If you can argue that, that would be interesting too. Okay. So Hale and Wright point out some controversy about whether or not implicit definitions are a legitimate form of definition. Such controversy also applies to axiomatic definitions, which are the typical examples of implicit definitions, at least in Hale and Wright's work, as far as I'm aware of it. Personally, I see little reason for fuss. To me, it's natural that you can explain the meaning of a word by giving rules that explain how to use the word. You can teach somebody, for example, how to use the word and by teaching them to follow the rules of inference for and described before. And you can teach somebody how to use the word true by teaching them the T-schema. Of course, the T-schema defines only one possible way of using the word true, and people might use it in other ways. So far, I've presented one definition, sense, or meaning for the word true. This is the meaning axiomatically defined by the T-schema according to Horwitchian minimalism. However, there are certainly other possible meanings. For example, one might define true as accurate to reality. This definition will be equivalent to the T-schema within the context of any conversation where by asserting a statement, one implicitly asserts that the statement is accurate to reality. So in my life, conversations I have at work in my professional capacity are examples of such conversations. As far as I'm aware, any definition of true which tells a person how to use the word true and is consistent with common usage is based on the T-schema or equivalent to it in appropriate contexts. If you find any counterexample to this statement, please tell me about it. The T-schema by itself is not enough to explain how to use the word true. Essentially, the T-schema references questions about truth to questions about norms of assertion. If you can rightly assert a statement, then you can rightly assert that that statement is true. Instead of asking, when is a statement true, you can ask, when can you rightly assert a statement? The latter is a question that this entire text is aimed at addressing. Still, some readers may feel that this misses the point. If we reduce questions about truth to questions about norms of assertion, then perhaps some readers feel we are no longer asking the questions they are interested in, because readers want to know what's true in the sense of what's real, what's actual. I don't want to convey the appearance of sidestepping these meaty questions in favor of surface questions about what we can say. I'm not just going to sidestep the meaty questions in the rest of this text, but yeah, I'm going to approach them in a very roundabout way, it is the author's hope that the reader can get closer to what's true in the sense of what's real and what's actual on the basis of what they're learning in this book. Now, I don't claim to know what's real and what's actual, and therefore I cannot claim to show the reader the path to come to know what's real and what's actual. However, it is my opinion that applying the techniques of this text, taken all together and used with art, skill, and fairness, will tend to help one figure out what's real and what's actual in practical terms in most problem domains that humans can get a grip on. No guarantees can be made that the methods I discuss will lead one to an accurate understanding of reality in any particular situation. I am unaware of any totally sure, provably infallible methods of knowledge gathering. Consistent with that, I am comfortable calling this text a method of seeking the truth. Alright, so let's close with some other theories of truth. So I've so far described one systematic theory of the meaning of true, namely Horowitzian minimalism. How does Horowitzian minimalism compare to other theories of truth? I will compare it briefly to A, a generic postmodern theory of truth, and B, a generic pluralist theory of truth, a la Michael P. Lynch, but only in like a very, very high level sense, right? I do not know the details of Michael Lynch's philosophy. And I don't even claim that what I discuss is going to be representative of his views. I think it is on a high level, but I could be wrong. Again, don't want to step on anybody's toes by misrepresenting a view. Okay, so our generic postmodern theory of truth runs as follows. Truth is relative. Truth is relative to a context, an observer, a point of view. Thus, there are many different truths, none absolute. Horowitzian minimalism does not go as far as this postmodern theory of truth. It does not positively assert that there is no absolute truth. It is silent on whether there is such a thing as absolute truth. However, Horowitzian minimalism agrees with this postmodern theory of truth as far as they both go. It agrees that truth is relative in this sense. The interpretation of true is relative to a conversational context which can establish norms governing assertion and thereby determine what can be called true in that context. Okay, so our generic pluralist theory of truth runs as follows. There are multiple kinds of truth. Horowitzian minimalism agrees with this, as different conversational contexts produce different versions of true, which behave substantially differently. However, some pluralist theories of truth will define meanings of true which are different from the minimalist meaning of true provided by the T-schema. My view does not discourage the progress of such projects, since my view allows for the consideration of definitions of true other than the Horowitzian minimalist definition of true. Horowitzian minimalism, as I've defined it, is not the most informative theory of truth, and it is only a theory. That's why I'm open to other theories of truth. To me, the value of Horowitzian minimalism is that it gives us one viable way of understanding the meaning of true, and therefore of treating our confusions around this word. It references questions about truth to questions about norms of assertion. This proves in practice to be a productive way of thinking about truth. Understanding norms of assertion takes in much of what humans know about seeking the truth, and it is the primary topic of the rest of this text.